Welcome to Creating Your Happy Place, a podcast that explores what it takes to create your happy place and then empowers you to do whatever it takes to get happy at home. I'm Rebecca West, host of Creating Your Happy Place and author of the book Happy Starts at Home, and I'm so glad you're here today. Now today, we're going to talk about what happens when we outgrow our homes. And if you've been thinking about building a backyard cottage, this episode is for you. Now, sometimes we outgrow our homes because the way we need them to function has changed, and sometimes we outgrow our homes because our families have gotten bigger. Maybe we've had some kids, maybe it's time to have our parents move in with us, maybe we need to create a more functional work from home experience, or maybe we want some extra income creating a rental space on our property. There are all kinds of reasons why we might need to think outside the box of our existing homes. Our guest today knows firsthand what it's like to go through making room in your existing home. She lives in a home that was built in 1922, but she added a second level to it to make sure there would be enough room for a growing family, which now includes one husband, 3 kids, 1 dog, 1 turtle, and 6 chickens. She not only went through the process of expanding her own home, but she also helps others do the same thing as a residential designer with her company, 180 Studio. I've invited her here today to talk about what we need to consider when we're thinking about changing the footprint of our homes, either by converting a space we already have or by adding a backyard cottage to our properties. So all that being said, I am delighted to welcome to the show residential designer, certified aging in place specialist, and ADU specialist, Val Sporleder. Welcome, Val.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's so good to be here.
I'm excited to have this conversation. Now, to start the conversation, I understand that when folks finally reach out to you, they've usually done a ton of research on ADUs. They've gotten a lot of generic information on the how-tos and the can they do that, but they're coming to you finally to figure out how can they add a backyard cottage on their specific property given their unique situation. But for folks who haven't started all that research yet, can you just start out by defining what an ADU or a DADU is?
Sure. ADU stands for accessory dwelling unit, and it's kind of a wonky term for a backyard cottage or an interior or internal living space that is completely separate, has its own kitchen, its own bathroom, its own bedroom. There's a lot of building code issues they have to meet. It's not just a room in the basement with a bar sink. It's a lot more than that. But a lot of people start there. So normally when I say ADU, I'm talking about the internal variety. When I say DADU or DADU, it's the backyard cottage, which is completely separate. It's like building a whole other single family resident home, right down to its own outdoor spaces.
So I'm curious, have you been seeing more interest in building these external cottages, backyard cottages, or internal ADUs since the pandemic? Has there been a change that you've noticed?
There's been 2 things that have caused more interest in it. The first probably being the city of Seattle loosening restrictions on building them. They've existed for a while, for a long while, very informally. I always like to refer to like Fonzie living over the Cunningham's garage and Happy Days.
Yes.
There's always been some version of it. And then about a decade or 2 ago, the city started actually calling it giving it a specific term and meaning and putting rules and sometimes restrictions on them. And sometimes the restrictions were really great, like you need to create a parking space. Well, in the urban center of Seattle, parking's really tight anyways. So to have to add a parking space for an occupant of a residence that probably doesn't even have a car, that was really hard hurdle for people to get over. So in August of 2019, the city of Seattle voted to loosen a lot of the restrictions. And the 2 big ones that people felt would be easier to build a backyard cottage is the parking. You didn't have to create that anymore. And the owner isn't required to live on the site full time, because that was another one that was really hard. People were like, well, I might retire and move south. And now I can't have my backyard cottage. And But that was a scary one because a lot of people, and me included, kind of was afraid developers would move in and really start changing what a backyard cottage was. So far, that hasn't happened. It's still a very personal experience for the person who lives on that lot and is choosing to build it. I really haven't ran into anyone that is building one and doesn't live on the property.
Yeah, I
So,
think that's a really good point. There's a lot of concerns, that whole not in my own backyard, not in my
mhm.
backyard mentality of worrying that, yes, you want to develop your property, but now there's not going to be as much parking on our street, or, rental properties aren't necessarily considered as community centered as non-rental properties. So I know that there can be a lot of contention around these discussions too.
And there was, the vote got delayed for months, maybe even up to a year or more because of that. But it did pass ultimately. And so people were hearing about it a lot in the news. And that was like August 2019. Well, by January, February 2020, things had really, really changed, but in a way that people were like, kind of put those two things together, like, hey, I've been hearing about these backyard cottages and these internal dwelling units. And now I have my whole family at home. We're all trying to do school from home. We're all trying to work from home. I have older family members, and I'm in this right now where I want the option to have them come live with me. And when I talk to my clients, it's usually like, we want our family close, but not too close.
Right, exactly. And
We all still need our separate spaces.
yeah, I mean, that's even shown up with people who maybe have gotten a COVID test and tested positive, and they need to isolate themselves even within their own internal family. We're
Yes.
demanding so much more of our homes in terms of that flexible, multi-purpose functionality, far beyond what any of us, I think, ever imagined
Yeah.
in years past.
It's our workspace, our living space, our school space, our everything space.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what are, and maybe we talk about this in from two different vantage points. What are some of the things that frequently come up that are limitations on being able to have an ADU, an internal ADU? And what are the limitations you often encounter when it comes to the backyard cottage or the dadu?
The internal ADU, which is normally in a basement, they can be in the attic, they can be an addition to the home, but most of my clients, in fact, I think almost all, I'd have to look through my projects, but have been in the basement. So the hard thing with basements, design-wise, is you want as much natural light as possible. That's a little harder in the basement, not impossible, but you have to plan for it more than you would on a main floor
Mm-hmm.
house. And the big one is egress requirements. So when normally you put the living spaces in the front where all the light is and where maybe if it's a walkout daylight basement, where the door is, and the bedrooms going back. Well, they're normally underground or somewhat underground. And so you really have to plan for that emergency escape window.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of different ways to meet that requirement, but it is something that can stop our project if you can't get that one thing done. The city, there's a lot of exceptions to many things, but health and safety is not one of them.
Right.
So, for obvious reasons. So there's things like that. And then separating the utilities can be hard.
Hmm.
Because you need to do that, especially the electrical panel. Not all utilities have to be separate, but the electrical panel is a big one. You have to be able to shut off your own electricity.
Hmm.
For a backyard cottage, a lot of those restrictions aren't there. So the biggest restriction for a backyard cottage or dadu is cost. It's building a whole nother house.
Yeah.
But instead of building a house and you moving into it, you're building a house and maybe renting it out and making income. So
Right.
there's a lot of numbers to be run when considering a backyard cottage.
So going to the internal dwelling for a second, speaking of egress, that's that emergency exit or entrance in case of a fire or some other kind of problem. Obviously, it's not something you want to avoid. I wouldn't try to do this, without permits and not to code, because if somebody is asleep and a fire happens, I assume you would like your person who is sleeping in that space to escape healthily. with their life and limbs intact. And one thing that people often don't think about is it's not just whether or not you or a small child could get out a small window, but you want a fully equipped fireman to be able to get in through that window.
Yeah, and I think people forget
bigger.
that sometimes. Yeah, it's like, no, you got to
Exactly.
imagine a firefighter with a tank on their back, most likely, crawling into your space and then taking you out of it. So,
Exactly.
or someone you love out of it. So it's definitely a place, you would never cut back
Yeah.
so it's a big one, but it's not one people normally think about when they're thinking about a new home.
Right, absolutely. And when it comes to the backyard cottages, obviously cost can be a really big prohibitive factor. And I always like to talk about, well, what kind of numbers are we looking at? But those numbers could be a huge range depending on how big the property is, or the building you're going to build is. But I'm assuming that in terms of building a from scratch property, we're talking at minimum, what, 200,000? Is that even too low?
I think that would have been okay about a year ago. But it's up from there. I
Yeah.
would say $250,000 or more. In a lot of it, really and a lot of times people want a square foot cost, but with
Mm.
backyard cottages, you can have a 300 square foot cottage or a 1,000 square foot cottage. But in the end, you still have to have a kitchen. You still have to have a bathroom. And so some costs don't change. Someone once was saying, to do a bigger backyard cottage, you're really just buying longer boards, like because all the other stuff is that cost is still there. You can't say, oh, kitchens are expensive, we're going to leave that out. So
Right.
it's really hard to calculate cost. And sometimes the cost is before you even start building, what kind of access do you have to your backyard? Are you on an alley and all the workers can pull up right there? Or are they taking everything, including, the concrete for the foundation through a 5 foot,
Side
setback
alley.
between your fence and your house? And, there's a lot, it makes the project a lot harder, logistics wise when it's
Right.
set up like that. So, and that's even
That's
before you start building.
And that's sort of like the same way a condo building, oftentimes the contractors will charge a lot more to do a remodel in a condo building because where are you going to park? Do you have access to the freight elevator?
Yeah.
Are you limited to certain hours when you can work? So the contractors are going to be considering how hard or easy is it going to be to execute this project when they're pricing it as well.
Yeah, exactly. And most homeowners wouldn't think about that part of it
Yeah.
as adding extra cost.
You mentioned setbacks when you were talking about like picturing the contractors bringing all their gear through this tiny little alley next to your house. I know the setbacks can have a really big impact on whether or not you can do a backyard cottage. People might look out in their backyard and go, I have plenty of space, not realizing that setbacks are a thing. So tell us what setbacks are and general knowledge about them.
Yeah, so a lot of times when people hear the general information, they're like, well, my lot is 3,200 square feet or bigger. I've met that requirement. I can now have a backyard cottage. But there's so many other things to take in account after that. So you're like, okay, you checked off box one. Excellent. Now let's go to the next one. You have to be 5 feet back from side and rear neighbors. You have to be a certain distance back from the main house, which can be 5 feet, or if you don't want to do all the fireproofing that's required for that, you got to be back 10 feet.
Hmm.
And then you might have a shed, an existing shed on your lot that's taking up, ground space. You might have an 8 foot tall deck that's taking up space. There's so many things that, I feel like this is the first thing I try to do when people contact me is I check the generic information, which they've probably already have, but I just double check that before we even meet to make sure it's worth meeting. And then I start to look at that more specific information. What can you do on your lot with
Hmm.
your existing stuff? And sometimes people will remove a shed. Sometimes they'll break up some concrete. It was just there when they moved in. They don't really ever use it. So there's so many specific things to each property that make it difficult. And another one is like a large significant tree. You
Mm.
can't just cut down any tree to put a cottage in because the city has a lot to say about trees. And it
Right.
doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's something we have to take into account, put on the site plan and discuss how it's going to be addressed.
So we're talking about like what kinds of structures are already existing on the property, because there's rules about how much of your land can be covered by houses and impermeable
Yeah.
product like
Surfaces and
concrete
stuff. Yeah.
and the
So along with
trees.
setbacks comes lot coverage and
Mm-hmm.
rear yard coverage and a lot of things that don't get talked about in general terms because there's no way you can give that information without knowing the specific lot that you're
Right.
talking about.
Of
So lots
course.
of land, all that falls under land use. So
Now,
not exciting.
no, but the results can be really exciting. It's just a matter of
Yeah, I mean,
knowing what checklist to go through.
yeah, it's definitely required, and it's something you have to think and talk about and document, but usually not as fun as picking what your house is going to look like.
I'm assuming that if somebody had a backyard shed or a backyard garage that already existed, that converting that into a backyard cottage is easier. Is that true?
Kind of depends on how the shed was built. I recently had a project where the garage was built in 1930. So any existing building has to be brought up to current codes. So it's really hard to bring a 1930s building up to current code. It can be done. I knew a contractor who dug holes to get underneath that existing concrete slab to put in footings and do all this, stuff to bring it up to code. But that takes a lot of time and money. And in the end, it's just a concrete slab that you could have broke up and replaced. And a lot of times when people break up the concrete on their property, I say, hey, let's not just send that to the recycler. Let's build a path, with those concrete chunks. Or so a lot of almost everything I talk about with my clients is how can we save money or how can we reuse this product? And so existing buildings, yeah, it's really case by case. But if it was a recently built existing building, you have a much better chance of reusing it for
That
sure.
makes sense. Yeah. And when you think about, sorry, let me change that question. Totally spaced on that. Okay. And when we go back inside, when we're thinking about the ADUs, the internal dwellings, I know that one of the things that has come up with some of my clients is that their ceiling heights aren't tall enough. So I'm wondering about a couple things. So first of all, is there a specific code that says how much ceiling height you have? Have you, what's the process of digging out a basement, or do you lift the house? And when you're thinking about an ADU inside of a home and somebody wants to make that downstairs space as open as it can be, what kind of structural work do you have to do? How does it affect the rest of the house above it?
Yeah, it's another one of those that's really case by case basis. I will say this about basements, because they are basements, and this doesn't apply to any other story of the house, but basements are holding up the whole house.
Mm-hmm.
So it is much harder to change things down there, and most jurisdictions realize that. So they give a little more leeway. In most living spaces, 7 foot is the required ceiling height. In a basement, you can get down to about 6'10". And even then, sometimes if you have beams that come down, there's a little bit of leeway for that. They're very aware that to change a basement is very difficult. However, you can't have a 6-foot ceiling down there either. And I don't think anyone would want to live in a 6-foot ceiling.
Right.
So then you would look at, okay, what's the best way to try to get more space? Sometimes it's getting rid of all the ductwork. Maybe you have a ductless heat pump now and get rid of that big furnace with all that big ductwork in the ceiling. It can be breaking up the slab and digging down further and pouring a new slab to get that height. I haven't heard of anyone raising a house. I mean, it's totally something people do, which I have heard. I have not had a project like this, but I've seen it done in my neighborhood, and I've talked to the contractors on the project, and it's actually not as crazy expensive as someone would think. Because I don't know why, because to me, it seems like the craziest thing to take this, especially older homes in Seattle, and raise the entire house and put in taller foundation walls and the structure changes that need to happen with that. It's like, how can that not be $1 million? But that being said, I haven't had a project. That's just, kind of talking with someone. But I really haven't run into that. Most people have enough room with some changes that aren't drastic. I would say putting in flush beams to get them up out of the living space and getting rid of ductwork. And maybe rerouting plumbing to get it all up into the floor. And what a lot of times people don't realize is basements weren't, at least in older homes, weren't meant to be living spaces.
Right.
So a lot of times you have to kind of walk it backwards and make it a living space first. You'll notice there's like a big drain in the basement. Well, they got wet, and that was okay because there was nothing down there. It just went down the drain. But nowadays, when a basement floods, it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
People have store all sorts of stuff down there. And then if it becomes a living space, it's a really big deal. So waterproofing a basement is probably the biggest one when converting that type of space, which not impossible. I have a basement now, a project where there was literally slugs in the basement because it was so moist. And so it's like, oh, good. Like, you've done the work for me. Is there moisture here? There's a slug. There's definitely moisture. So, so all of that stuff has to be mitigated first before you start putting carpet down on something like that.
Absolutely. That seems fairly essential. Now, thinking about once you've established if it can be done, how you're going to go about it, where you're going to build it and stuff like that, then there's the actual design of the space. And I know that in the past, these spaces were often thought about for like the mother-in-law use, right? Letting your parents come live with you. And so they were really focused on the elderly. But with the reverse empty nesting that's happening, a little bit more multi-generational living in general, rental spaces, work from home spaces, what's your process for either thinking about how to design a space specifically for those needs, because I know you are a certified aging in place specialist, or trying to make a space as multi-use or flexible as possible?
I really, so this is what I found with my aging in place specialist. Nobody thinks they're aging. And nobody really wants to talk about their aging, even if they admit that they might be getting older. So I really focus on the universal design aspect of it. Like, we're going to make this doorway wider. I'm not going to tell you why, because, you won't even notice 32, 34, 36 inches. People notice when it gets really small, but they don't notice when it's bigger. So I'm like, we'll just put in this size door and it will make a huge difference in the future, possibly. If nothing ever comes to fruition with needing a wheelchair, it's okay. It's just a wide door. Right. So a lot of things, I really focus on that part of it because no one wants to design their space with that in the forefront. Although that being said, I do have a client now who she is so awesome. She is 80 years old and she did so much research before contacting me. And she is so well aware of her, what she's going to need to live there. And she is fully on board with the planning and designing a space that her and her 85-year-old husband can live in. So by that point, I think a lot of people they're like, hey, if I'm going to live on my own, it's got to be, it's got to have these certain things. So I do kind of sneak it in there, so to speak. And that tends to work better than saying, we're going to do an aging in place design.
Right. Well, and the reality is any of us at any age could break a leg or become otherwise incapacitated. Yeah. And that has nothing to do with age. It just has to do with, that, as you said, universal accessibility so that your house isn't an obstacle for you no matter what's happening.
Yeah, and that's a big one. The accident, if you break a leg, if you're using a walker, or even just the foot scooter, the people that have one leg, and then I don't know the medical term for it, but they have it looks like a scooter for their leg that they have to hold up. But any sort of wheeled device, and a lot of times even people with small children, so I really kind of try to encompass all of that where, no one wants to fall down in the bathroom, right? I mean, none of us. And it's one of the most dangerous places in the home. So anything we can do to make it safer and is going to to be good for everybody.
Yeah.
So I really try to focus on that aspect of it. And then maybe even plan for, a big one is cabinets. Like you can get a cabinet that looks completely ordinary, and then maybe if it comes to a point where you need to use that kitchen in a wheelchair, you can convert the cabinet to have space underneath it so you can get there with your wheelchair. So there's lots of things too that can be, as long as you always keep aging in place in mind, or universal design in mind, you can convert those things as they come about very easily. Another good one is blocking in the wall. Like in a bathroom, no matter what bathroom I'm designing, I'm like, let's just put blocking all over in the wall in that height where a grab bar might be. And then when it comes time for that, it's just as simple as putting in a couple screws, not trying to find a stud or worried you're going to hit a plumbing pipe or.
Right. So when you say blocking, you're talking about some wood that's hidden inside the walls, behind the tile. It's not unsightly. It's just there, so you have something to screw into later.
No one would even know it was there. Yeah. So it's something totally hidden that's can make such a big difference later on. And cheap, it's just scrap wood usually that you put in there. So super easy to do. I try to hit all those super easy, super low budget type things.
That's super. Now, you've gone through your own remodel, and we all know that no project is perfect. So when you think about the addition that you did, the goals that you had, and you look back on it, is there anything you would have done differently?
Cost was a big front of mind for me. So I'm very conscious of that with all of my clients. I try to do, everything, put it all up front, and I try to do things in phases, because what I learned from mine is that, well, the big thing I learned from mine is I had a designer that showed up once, took measurements, went home, drew up a plan, and said, we're done. And I was like, but we're not done. You didn't even ask me what I wanted in my space, or you didn't ask me, like, I don't want the stairs there. My house isn't a grand entrance stair type of house. I want my stairs in the back of the house, in a private kind of stairwell. And so the one thing I learned from that is, like, I really would have wanted to work with someone that had a lot of back and forth with me. And we really nailed down a design that was going to be long-term and perfect for me and my family. Instead of, there's a couple things that I'm like, oh, we should have done this, we should have done that. But at the time, this was 25 years ago. So, it was before I was even started my company at all, but I learned a lot from it. And with my business, I'm like, I don't want to do it that way. I didn't know exactly how I wanted to do it, but I didn't want to do it that way. I feel like design in the home is so personal that you can't just slide something, be there once and slide a design across the desk and say, there you go. So there's a lot to it when it's your own space, so much more than, say, a commercial space or a space that you're not going to be living in. And so a lot of times my clients will say their backyard cottage is for rental. But then along the way, it becomes pretty personal. They're like, I get to design this thing. I want to make it how I would like it. And I would, might want to live there, which is good, because it has happened that way, that they've got done with this brand new customized space. And now they're like, I want to move in there and rent out my old 1920 house and move into this really cool, nice, perfectly designed space that very low maintenance. And, I would say my approach to design was very much driven by my experience with my remodel, because it's such a personal space, and you really need that you need that back and forth, and you need that feedback from the client to really nail down something that's a really big investment.
Yeah. Now, you said that the design that you were handed had like this grand entrance kind of staircase. Did you end up with that, or did you then take those designs to somebody else, or did you rework them on your own? Like, what did you do when you went, this isn't what I wanted?
Yeah, I sent it back. So I have to set the stage for my remodel. I had two kids. One was 6, well, one was almost a year old, one was almost 3 years old. And at some point during the remodel, I got pregnant for the third time. And I was GCing the project. So there was so much going on that I really had to pick my battle basically. This staircase is all wrong. It needs to go over here. Handed it back. He did it, he updated it and sent it back, which is good. So I did get that taken care of, but there was a lot of little stuff that we were like, if we only had more time and had more back and forth, we would really have an end design that we truly love. Now, both me and my husband do a lot of work on our house, so we've kind of made that happen over the years anyways. But yeah, at the time it was just get her done and whatever it takes. Yes to whatever the framers were asking me or so. I'm like, we just need to move into this house. Right. And moved in on Christmas Day with plywood floors and unfinished drywall. Well, finished drywall, but not primed or painted yet. And if you really want, you can cut this story out later, but one of my kids, I was potty training. At the same time, I was laying tile in my bathroom. And so he was running in there to go to the bathroom. They always wait till the last minute. Well, I had removed the toilet and he went running into the bathroom to use the toilet and there was no toilet. Oh. Luckily it was my boy child. So he improvised and just peed down the sewer pipe.
Oh, that's hilarious.
But he was so mad at me. I was like, I just wasn't thinking ahead, just doing my tile job and, pregnant doing that. So really not thinking about anyone else, but getting that job done. And yeah, that was one of those things where it was like, okay, I'm done.
And obviously as designers, and contractors too, we would recommend that people don't do design or modeling in an emergency, in a hurry. Yes. But a lot of times what sparks these projects are life changes. And so you can't always plan for the perfect time. It's like trying to have a baby at the perfect time. There is no perfect time. These things are always happening when the normal life is already happening.
And I really coach that with my clients. I'm like, we're going to do tons of planning. We're going to do all the drawings. We're going to pick the finishes. We're going to pick the appliances. We're going to get it all done so that when those things crop up, it's not a huge emergency. It's just a little emergency because we've done so much pre-planning and thinking about what could happen that we're very prepared for something to not go right, because in a remodel or construction project, it's very likely that something will pop up, whether it's personal with the family or personal with the contractors, or maybe a city requirement that comes up, or in older homes, you open something up and the termites or mold or, something is in that wall that wasn't known. So it will happen. It's just a matter of really mitigating when it does happen.
Right. Having enough planned that you have energy left over to deal with the unexpected things that'll pop up.
Yeah. And I always try to say, this and this might happen. Like I'm kind of a doomsdayer designer. I talk a lot about, sometimes too much, about this might be a possibility. This might be a possibility. But I don't want my clients to be surprised. I don't want them to be like, I had no idea that's something that could happen. And I think sometimes as designers and contractors, we sometimes forget that we have so much knowledge that the client does not.
Right.
And so something that's really obvious to us might not be obvious to them. Like we're like, well, it's a 80-year-old home. Of course, there's probably some mold in the bathroom wall, from when they originally did this and didn't have the building science information that they have now. But a client doesn't really think about those sort of things.
Right. Absolutely. So broad picture, what would you like people to know when they're thinking about these kinds of projects, whether it's ADUs or DADUs, backyard cottages? What is it that you would like them to take away today?
The pre-research on their part is so good, and there's so many resources for that. I'm going to put up on my site just because I feel like it's very scattered right now. So I try to put resources up on my site to say, this is where you can go find the generic information. And then I have a service set up where it's just a consultation where I look at all that generic information and take it with me to the consult. And we really talk about, okay, how does this apply to your lot? To see, and then we talk about cost a little bit before we dive into anything, because you need to know if it's possible.
Right.
And a lot of times, if the backyard cottage cost really takes them aback, I'm like, well, do you know about internal ADUs? Those are usually a lot cheaper to build out, for sure, because your foundation and walls and roof are already there, and a lot of the utilities. So then the next step is usually a feasibility study. Like, let's dive into this and see what's possible on your lot. Now we know that you can do it, and we know kind of what it would look like for you. Let's talk a little bit about the design part of it and really get to that. So I guess what I would want people to know is it's a process. It's not one contractor showing up and saying, yeah, I can build you a cottage. And then he leaves, and you're like, well, what about all those thousands of details that I need before I, commit $300,000 to this project and,
Right.
6 months of my life to construction in my backyard. So as much research as they can do, and then kind of the baby steps with me to see if they have the stomach for this, and then how much I can help them. Because sometimes people are scared to do it or don't want to do it. But then as they get more information and talk to me and kind of learn what the just get very much more informed, that it takes some of that scariness away.
Yeah. Now, if you encounter somebody and either the budget isn't there or the property won't allow them to do what they had in mind, are you also able to help them come up with ideas to make the existing house work better? Maybe you're not going to create that separate living space, but let's say they were trying to create a better work from home experience or better multi-generational living within what they already have. They just can't, for whatever, expand on that. Can you give them ideas on that too?
Yeah, in fact, that's the other thing I do besides a doomsdayer designer is I talk them out of additions. Because a lot of times the only people live in this space, and so it's really hard, even in my own house. When you live in a space, to think outside of the box. It's like, well, this has always been the kitchen, or this has always been this spot. How can it ever be different? And so, like, I had a client who they wanted to really increase the bathroom in their master bath and make it a true master bath, and had this big addition in mind. It's second story. I was like, you have a 3,000 square foot house. There's two of you. We can figure out a way to do this without adding any space. It turned out great. They're very happy with it. They got an office space also along with that. So a lot of it is just, it's like this puzzle of reconfiguring space. And I can go in and look and say, oh, maybe this, maybe that. But it's really when I get the CAD out and start saying, okay, we're going to draw this to scale. A lot of times I'll have clients that give me a sketch and the to scale part is missing. That's super, super important. So I really get down to exactly how much space we have and how much space you need for certain rooms or appliances or functions that happen in that space. So yeah, there's usually a lot we can do within an existing space. And a lot of it comes down to learning how the client uses it now and how they foresee using it in the future. And a lot of times it's planning for flexibility, multi-use and flexibility.
Yeah.
Those are the keywords these days.
I love it. So if people want to find some of the resources you were talking about on your website, or if they want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
They can get in touch with me at 180 Studios. So number 1, architectural design is what the AD stands for, studio.com. And on my site, I have a blog that's more a frequently asked questions blog where they can find out, what is an ADU, what is a DADU, what are the differences? Because I know we all hear stuff, but it's hard to keep that all in in mind. And then I have a lot of places where links that you can go to find out, mostly the city of Seattle, because that's where I work.
Mhm.
But jurisdictions outside of city of Seattle have very different rules, usually easier because the lots are bigger. So there's links for that on my website. And then, a consultation, that's probably the best way to just get that initial, and that's all on my website, under the work with me, to just, let's talk. Let me talk and stand in your backyard or in your home, and let's talk so that all the information you're getting is super specific. So yeah, there's a lot of generic stuff out there, and the city of Seattle, actually, this is a big one too, has something called ADU Universe. And if you just Google that, it will bring you to a site that will tell you a lot about your property simply by typing in your address. But once again, it's kind of generic information, but it is at least specific to your lot. So it's a really good starting point for sure.
And you don't mind if people do some research on their own, or do you actually even prefer if they do some research on their own first?
Yeah, I prefer it because I feel like we all need to hear information multiple times before we remember it or it sinks in. So if they do some research and I come with my research, and then we write down this, kind of forget about the generic stuff that doesn't apply to their site, bring together the specific stuff that applies to their site. For example, if someone has an environmentally critical area, if their backyard is in an ECA, there's a lot that has to be taken into account with that, where if someone does not have an ECA, then forget that information. It doesn't apply to your lot. It's just extra information you don't even need to know about. But sometimes they don't know that right up front. So that's kind of what the consultation is pay attention to this part, forget about that part, and then let's really concentrate on only the information that has to do with your situation.
And just for folks who might not know, an environmentally critical area would be like maybe if they have a stream running through their property or something like that.
Yeah, that was a big one. Yeah, that was a big one for me up in Lake Forest Park, a stream. Beautiful, right? Who doesn't want a stream in their backyard? But now you have to stay 50 feet away from that stream to build. And so not many people have a backyard big enough for that. So all of a sudden that changes a lot of things about what people thought they could do, because they have this big open area in their, this huge backyard. They're like, I have plenty of space for a backyard.
They're not allowed to use any of it.
Yeah. So those are the specific things that, can really, and we're still doing one. It's just right up next to the house, which wasn't the preferred spot, but still able to do it. So everything's usually doable. It's just, you really got to know the ins and outs of what to consider when doing that.
That's fantastic. And obviously to our listeners, we'll have all of the links that she just described in the show notes. So you don't have to have written all that down and remember it. You can go right to the show notes and find it. I've enjoyed this conversation so much. Thank you so much, Val, for sharing your expertise. It's clear that you have gone around this merry-go-round more than once on these kinds of projects.
I have, and I love the concept of the ADU because it's just it's a way for the average homeowner to really maximize their property for their family and or for income or both. So it's a really good housing model, and we're all getting used to living closer together, more European.
And I guess that's a good point. As expensive as it is to build another property on your property, it's still less expensive than buying an entire new property. So
exactly.
It's all relative to what are your goals and what do you have available to invest in those goals.
Yeah. And it's really fun to design your own house. So
there are fun if you have the right help.
Yeah. I feel like we talked about a lot of the stuff I do that I will do for you. That's the boring stuff, but there's this fun stuff is left to the client. Pick your countertops and your flooring and let's have fun with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was fun.
And to our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Creating Your Happy Place and that you feel a little bit more encouraged and informed about these kinds of ideas and empowered to make your home your happy place, whether that takes small projects or some big projects like we've been talking about today. If you feel stuck about how to make your house work for you at all, you can always check out my book, Happy Starts at Home. It's full of exercises meant to help you figure out why your home isn't working for you so that you can bring those problems to the table with somebody like Val or myself. And if you have a specific small design dilemma you just need some help with, you can always reach out to my team at Seriously Happy Homes as well. We can even meet with you over Zoom to figure out some practical steps to creating your happy place. But if you are looking at a whole edition, you should reach out to Val instead. In the meantime, no matter where you call home, no matter how big it is or how small it is, I hope it makes you seriously happy. Until next time.